So good morning, everybody. Welcome to Finland. I know most of you haven't been here. And welcome to ICCSS 2015, or as we like to call it, IC2S2 2015. The first question to ask is why IC2S2? The answer is that there's been a major shift in the social sciences in the last years. In the good old times, collecting data wasn't as easy as it is today. You had to ask people, and that couldn't be done in large numbers, small groups, like the famous sociograms by Jacob Moreno. It's like kids at school, triangles are boys, circles are girls. Then you're asking, where are your friends? Who do you talk to? But we know that now it's different. Something has happened. We are literally overwhelmed with data. Data about mobile communication, email communication, and of course, online media. We do have a session about that, running the whole week. Using badges, sociometers, to track your position, to see if you're sufficiently close to another guy wearing a badge, if you're interacting, talking to the guy. So we'll be hearing something about that too. So because of this, it's not surprising that over the last years, there have been already many events about this topic. I just put some, just flash a few slides. The series in Stanford, and others. It was in Warwick. I think this was 2 weeks ago. And even the Lipari school is going to have a dedicated school on that. Specific, of course. So, but what was missing is an open conference where the guys from different disciplines can finally meet and discuss without throwing objects at each other, trying to make, civilized debate and discussing about the problems. So when last year I started discussing with a number of people, discussing Michael about that, we said, so who are the best people, the world's best people in this area? And then we made a list. Then I said, let's do something new. Let's invite all of them. Then Michael said, what is this? Okay. He said, it's never going to work. There's so many people coming from the States. Finland is a small place. It's kind of far away. It was much more polite than that. It was very diplomatic. Just kind of giving you the short version of it. Then I told him, don't worry. I'm going to make them an offer they cannot refuse. I'm Sicilian, right? So of course, the content of those invitation emails are classified. So you're not going to see them. But here they are. So what is IC2S2? In a word, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity for people that would hardly meet at more specialized events to finally meet and say, I'm also working on that problem. So what's your angle? What's your approach? An opportunity to foster new interactions between people from different fields, to make people meet, discuss, and to hopefully accelerate the progress in this area. You received a number of emails from me and tweets and everything, so perhaps it was a bit too much, but of course this was a new thing. So I apologize if sometimes there was a bit an overflow of information. I personally always prefer to have an excess of information than not to have enough information. And one of the things I told you is that, of course, I would say because of the incredible lineup that we managed to put together, that we got an incredible response. 492 submissions, an unprecedented number in complex systems. It was painful that we couldn't, of course, accept so many of them. I can perhaps also one time tell you some of the emails I received because of this. Talking about intimidating emails, but we had to make choices, we had to rely on our PC. And also here, there will be more than 400 participants. It's more or less a geographic distribution. So it's kind of sufficiently complete. Of course, the south of the world is a bit missing. Nobody from Antarctica, that's a bit annoying. But I think we can live with that. Just to give an idea what the menu is going to be, this is the attack cloud extracted from the titles of all presentations, oral and poster presentations, to be featured here this week. So you can recognize perhaps your own keywords. You can see that some of them are bigger than others because perhaps a bit generic, like social, network, We also have a network session here. But that's pretty much what you're going to see. You have the program and everything is in your booklets, so you can take a look and decide where to go. So that was basically my intro. I have a couple of general information for all of you. We're going to have 5 parallel sessions. Today, on Wednesday, and on Thursday. There will be no parallel sessions tomorrow. One will be here. One will be in Hall B next door. The other 2 will be downstairs, so just 1 floor down still in the Congress wing. And number 5 will be the other side of the building. You have to walk a bit to get there, but we decided to add an additional session just because we got this incredible response to give more opportunities to accept a few more talks to make more people happy and to increase the volume of the event and still making it workable. So I apologize for the small work you have to do. You see that there are assistants. You can recognize them with the orange T-shirt. So they will help you out. If you have questions about everything, ask them, ask me, everybody involved in the organization. And tonight, we're going to have the reception at City Hall, which is something that only a few events happening here have the chance to have. It's quite an honor for us. And the City Hall is in the Market Square, which is in a 25 minutes walk from here. The path of the walk is shown in your booklet. There is a map just at the end of it, in case you want to go there on your own. But if you prefer to go somebody, we organize some walking tours from here starting at 6:10, every 10 minutes. The last one leaving at 6:30, because it takes about half an hour to get there. So we want to be there a few minutes before, because they are very strict about this, and they're going to throw us out at 8:30. So we couldn't really negotiate very much, because this is what they do all the time. So if you want to go there, to be walked there, then just be outside around those times, 6:10, 6:20, 6:30, and then you will see some of the assistants, and they will take you there. So hopefully it's not going to be raining. There are other ways to get there. Otherwise, there's the trams, there are taxis, hopefully. But it's a nice walk, because it's through the whole city. So perhaps some of you haven't spent enough time in the city to visit it a bit. So it's a best opportunity to walk around. OK, so we have a great show this week. These people are here. And now, I would like to leave the floor for a few minutes to one of Finland's greatest scientists, Professor Risto Nieminen, Dean of the School of Science of Aalto University and academician of Finland, and for some short welcome. And of course, I take the chance to thank him, because probably without him, we wouldn't be here today. He really supported this event from the very first day. He made opportunities for us. Some of the materials you find is provided by Aalto, notebooks, other things. So thanks a lot. So, Risto.
Good morning, and thank you, Santo, for the introduction, and thank you for the invitation to say a few words to welcome you to this very exciting event. I'm the Dean of the School of Science, as Santo mentioned, from Aalto University, and I feel my obligation to say a few words about Aalto. First of all, Aalto is the name of the architect who designed this building, among many others, but probably the most famous Finnish architect, which we are very proud of. But it's also the name of a new university, a 5-year-old university, which has a history that goes back 150 years. 5 years ago, 3 universities in the metropolitan Helsinki area, the University of Technology, a School of Economics, and School of Art and Design were merged together to form a new entity called Aalto University, and that's your host university for this week. The School of Science is one of the 6 schools, and as you see, as you can understand from the name, it represents the basic sciences, physics, mathematics, computer science, and so on. In addition, we have engineering, we have business, we have design and art in the university, about 400 faculty, about 15,000 students. The main campus is in Otaniemi, about 8 kilometers from here, west of downtown Helsinki. I hope you have a chance to visit the Otaniemi campus as well. I'm very excited about this topic of this conference. I'm a physicist myself. I work in condensed matter physics, computational physics, statistical physics, and that kind of work. And I know that many of my colleagues have moved over to complex systems, computational this and computational that. And now we are talking about computational social science, which to me is a really intriguing and interesting, exciting phenomenon where we see the movement of quantitative methods, big data, computer-based modeling into systems with a lot of human social relevance and interest. We've also noticed the emergence of this field in the country more widely, and the main Research Council of Finland has actually initiated recently a digital humanities program. So there will be a targeted research program in the digital humanities area. I don't want to take much more of your time. You have a very busy schedule ahead of you. I certainly wish, and I'm sure you will have an exciting and successful meeting, and hope that you will also have a chance to see a little bit of Helsinki around you. This is the best time of the year to visit this city. Hopefully the weather will be reasonable this week, and you can see a few of the interesting places around this conference site. So once again, welcome to Helsinki, welcome to Aalto, welcome to Finland, welcome to IC2S2. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lada Adamic. I'm a computational social scientist at Facebook, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Michael Macy, who is the Goldwin Smith Professor of Arts and Sciences and Director of the Social Dynamics Laboratory at Cornell, where he has worked since 1997. He has published in all the leading journals, and not just social science publications, but computational social science publications answering important questions such as why do liberals drink lattes? And also why do humans, like birds, tweet at certain times of day? So without further ado, here's Michael Macy.
And thank all of you for coming. It's a really exciting conference that we have this week. And actually, I'd like to just take a minute to thank Santo. What he said is absolutely right. When he first proposed the idea to me, I was not sure that this would be such a big event and be so successful. But I think the reason that it worked out so well is that Santo brought three qualities to the project. Just boundless energy and enthusiasm, an incredible network of contacts across the sciences, and perhaps most important, a vision of computational social science that's really inspirational. And I think that had a lot to do with generating the interest in this event. So please join me just to thank Santo for making all this happen. And I also want to thank all the people here at Aalto University who worked very hard with Santo to make this happen. So we're really all very, very indebted to them as well. So I want to thank. So yes, it's quite an honor to be giving the opening address here. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about the opportunities and challenges of computational social science. And the outline of my talk is to address three questions. First, what is computational social science? Second, is big data the end of theory, or is it the end of statistics? And the third question, which has to do with the opportunities, are they explanation, are they measurement, and we'll, along the way, look at some research that addresses some of these questions. So first, what is computational social science? And I think of it as computer-enabled investigations of human behavior and social interaction. And three components of that. First, computational modeling and simulation, especially agent-based modeling of complex systems. The digital traces of online interaction, sometimes called big data. And virtual labs. And I'm going to give some examples of each. But I want to begin with this question of the end of theory. So the end of theory was proclaimed back in 2008 by Chris Anderson in Wired magazine, a famous article in which he basically says that, look, you know, we have all these data and we have these really fast computers. Why do we need theory? And he quoted George Box, this famous quote from Box, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And he took the first part of that, I guess, to say that, you know, we don't need theory. The models are wrong anyway, so why bother? And that quote was picked up by Peter Norvig at Google, who ran with the same idea. So he changed it just a little bit. All models are wrong, and increasingly you can succeed without them. So we just don't need this anymore. But I want to suggest a couple of reasons why we do need theory in the era of big data. The needle and the haystack. So first, the needle. So finding the needle. Well, this is an actual statistical analysis of a relationship between X and Y where it's a fairly strong relationship. I mean, it's not overwhelming. You can see that line is sloping. With visual inspection is all you need to see that relationship. But it's actually with an N of 100, and that's the actual data. With an N of only 100, it's not statistically significant. We wouldn't want to publish that result because we can't rule out the possibility maybe that's just random chance. Now, let's do the same thing, but now this time we're going to increase the N. This, again, is an actual analysis of data. I'm going to increase the N from 100 to 10 million. Now, 10 million actually is not all that large. We work with data that's an order of magnitude larger than that. So this is just 10 million. And now we have a relationship, a correlation which is vanishingly small. It is almost zero. And what's the p-value going to be? Well, before it's 0.09. What's this one going to be? 0.0001. No problem publishing this non-result. And so the problem is that we now have all these data. We can find the needle. We can find needles that are incredibly small. But the question is, do we care? And to answer that question, we no longer can use statistical significance as the criterion. We have to use theoretical significance. And for that, we need theory. The second reason has to do with the haystack. So the haystack problem is that, you know, when it rains, it pours. So before, we've had lots of theory in the social sciences, but we haven't had great data, not very much, and suddenly we have more data than we know what to do with. And how do we find the interesting results in all that data? So there's a wonderful quote from Duncan Watts, who will be speaking to you later this week. We finally have our telescope in reference to big data and online networks. But the question is, how do we decide where to point it? And for that, again, we need theory. And what I want to suggest is that this is really not the end of theory. Big data is really the beginning of theory. And the sort of major take-home point that I would like to leave you with today is really just this, that what's important about big data is not that it's big, but that it's different. And that's what I want to address. So as a backdrop, what have we been doing for big data in the past? Well, it wasn't very big in comparison, but large quantitative population scale studies in social science have mostly used surveys for the past century, and certainly the past 50 years. And these surveys rely on samples, stratified random samples, that differ from the underlying population deliberately. Deliberately. They're not supposed to be the same as the underlying population. And they differ, so we know the ways in which they unintentionally differ, underrepresented, hard to reach populations, and we work really hard to try to overcome that. But these are deliberate ways. So the first, of course, is size. That's sort of the point. We don't want to try to interview everybody, so we're going to have 1,500 people instead. So that's one important difference. But there's another deliberate difference with the underlying population that I find we often just don't think about. It's not on our radar. And that difference, people in the sample, the respondents in the survey, have no friends in the sample. They have no coworkers, no colleagues, no next-door neighbors, no one who influences them, and no one who they influence in the sample. Which means we don't have data on that, which means we cannot use that in an explanation. And so what do we use? Where do we go for our explanations? Well, suppose we want to understand human behavior by understanding how people think. And what are their opinions, their beliefs, their attitudes? Where do these come from? Well, the answer to that question is dictated by the data that we have from those surveys, from those samples in which there are no friends. But we have data about the individual attributes of the respondents. So we know about their education, their occupation, their income. And from that, we can figure out their party alignment, their ideology, their beliefs, their opinions. And it's not just in a general sense. It's for that individual. It's that individual's own education, occupation, and income that affects their opinion. It's all within them. In other words, it's an atomistic explanation, and that's because that's the data that we have. So that's where we go with those explanations. And these atomistic explanations are reasonable. I mean, the idea is that we have personal experiences, and we have material interests, and those shape our behavior and the way we think. But it's not the whole story. There's another important part of human behavior, and that's the relational component. The ways in which there are things not just within us, but between us that affect our behavior. There's social influence, and there's homophily, and the self-reinforcing dynamic in which the more we interact, the more similar we become, the more similar we are, the more we interact. So, one of the implications of this contrast between within and between explanations, between atomistic and relational, is addressed in a paper that we recently published that addresses this very important scientific question, as Santo pointed out, Lada pointed out, why do liberals drink lattes? And in this study, we used computer simulation, we used an agent-based model to show what happens when you leave out the neighbors. So we set up a world in which we just pick two variables. Let's say, we'll call it education and liberal beliefs. And we see a relationship, the more education, the more liberal. And that's a kind of classic from the sociological literature. And so this is what we actually have. This is the ground truth. That's the relationship that we create in this simulated world. And if we were to take a survey in that world, that's what we would observe, and we would have it right. Because we haven't turned on any influence, there's no homophily. This is the world of the random sample. This is the world of the opinion survey, in which people are all thinking for themselves as if they lived on a deserted island with no influence from anyone else. And that's what we would find. But now, the nice thing about simulation is that we can throw the switch, and we can turn influence back on. So let's do that. Now we're going to just run the same simulation again. This time, there's influence, there's homophily, there's tendency to become more similar to the people who are our friends, to differentiate from those who we dislike in the outgroup. And what happens? We get that. And so then, if we take a survey in this population, we're going to have these very strong relationships between education and liberalism. And because the respondents in our survey have no friends, we're going to assume all of that effect was due to education, to something within the individual, and we'll be way off by an order of magnitude. That this very small atomistic effect gets blown up by the dynamics of sorting in that population and influence in that population. So what I suggest is that really it's not the end of theory, it's the beginning of theory, that big data and data from online social interactions has this important theoretical implication. That for 50 years we've had these very atomistic theories in social science, in part because that was the data that we had. We had data about those individuals with their histories and their attributes. And now we finally have relational data at population scale. So that's the good news. Now, here's the bad news. The bad news is that these big data are still, at the end of the day, they're observational. And observational data has inherent limitations, and those limitations really center on the attempt at explanation. They're very good for measurement, not so good for explanation, because we can't control confounding factors. And so in a way, I think that the era of big data is the era of measurement. But you know, we shouldn't trivialize that, because in a way, this is really an enormous breakthrough. It means that we can now test things that we could never test before because we couldn't measure them before. So computational social science is in some ways a young science. And in these early years, a lot of the focus should be on measurement, on detecting the patterns that we could not see before. Even if we can't explain, it's important even to just be able to see what it is that's happening that needs explanation. So I'm going to give you an example from some work we published a few years ago in which we map the social network of an entire country, which has never been done before. We've had social networks mapped at the level of a school, a workplace, maybe even a small village. We did the entire UK. So the image you see on the left is from NASA. It's a satellite image of the UK. And now I'm going to show you another image. And this is from work that I did with Nathan Eagle and Rob Claxton, in which we collected telephone logs. We obtained telephone logs for the UK. And from those telephone logs, we constructed bidirected social relationships among millions of people, tens of millions of people, 65 million people, 360 million ties that are reciprocated, where one person calls the other who calls them back. And here's what that image looks like. And it's really an uncanny resemblance to what the UK looks like when the picture is taken with a camera, which shows you the close correspondence between social networks and spatial relationships, the spatial constraint on social interaction. So that even when people have the ability to interact over long distances, face-to-face interaction still dominates. But why stop at the level of a country? So the next step, let's go all the way up to the global level. Let's do planet Earth. So this is a study of global social networks that was recently published. This is work with Bogdan State from Facebook, Ingmar Weber from QCRI, and Patrick Park, who was a student in my lab. And in this study, we wanted to see if online social media can bridge cultural boundaries. So the boundaries that we're looking at were proposed by Samuel Huntington over 20 years ago in the very early days of the World Wide Web. And he posited 8 civilizations. And here they are depicted around the world: Western, Orthodox, Islamic, and so on. And the question is, with 20 years later with online data, are those boundaries now pretty much blended away? Are they eviscerated by the technology? So to find out, we obtained Yahoo's email logs, all anonymized, no message content, just the logs. And from their global email logs, we constructed planet Earth's social network. We had to estimate it to take into account Yahoo's share of the email market, the internet access in different countries, so we adjusted for all those things. And then we created a network visualization in which the nodes are colored with the 8 colors in Huntington's theory of the clash of civilizations. And the nodes are arranged based on not the density of communication, but the density of social interaction, the density of the social ties. So the ties are the ties between an individual in one country and another individual in another country with whom they exchange email. So Huntington predicts that we're going to have monochromatic clusters, and that is indeed exactly what we found. Very strong evidence that online social networks reproduce the pattern that Huntington predicted in the era prior to online social networks, so only in their infancy. So the clustering remains, and then we tested for, there's the US, the first one on the left, and then Finland. You can see that Finland's a little bit more in the center. The US is sort of a bridge a little bit between a couple of the different clusters. So then we wanted to look at the mechanisms, and so we used quadratic assignment to do a multivariate model that took into account all things which might affect social densities between countries, common language, borders, common histories, and Huntington civilizations. And when we controlled for this long list of other factors, civilization was still a significant effect. So what does it take to open the echo chambers? Well, it seems that online social interaction is not enough. But what about shared organization? What if everybody's in the same company? So this is work that I did with Wei Dong, a student in my lab, Kate Ehrlich, and Michael Muller from IBM. And we obtained data from an IBM company-based social media system that's sort of like a company email, if you will, but it's more like Facebook in the way that it operates, for all their employees, nearly 300,000 worldwide. And we ran the same analysis again, this time with everybody's in the same organization. Now, with everybody in the same organization, will that bridge the cultural divisions that Huntington proposed? And the answer is no. We still get the same clustering that we got before. There's the US and Finland. So shared organization is not enough. Well, what about if everybody is working together on the same task? So we tested that by taking just the people who are on sales teams. So 15,000 worldwide employees, all involved on the same task, sales. Bingo. Finally, we overcome the cultural divisions. And in fact, we found that on a sales team, there was actually a slight preference for diversity. People were more likely to interact across the cultural boundaries than within. Another study that we're just about to submit, this is with 2 students in my lab, Yangren Shi and Fedor Dakshin, and also James Evans and Bill Shi from University of Chicago. We wanted to find out, is science able to escape the echo chambers? Is it above the culture wars? So here's the culture war. These are Amazon co-purchases of political books, colored red or blue or pink, depending on whether they're left, right, or center. And a lot of this book must look a little bit familiar to you, to Divided We Blog from a few years ago. You see that the reds and the blues are very clustered, but the blues reach out a little bit more than the reds. Now the question is, where is science in all this? And there's where science is. So we looked at the co-purchases between books and science, and those red and blue books that you saw in the previous slide. And there you have it for the major Dewey Decimal disciplines. And it looks to me like in general you could attribute this, interpret this as the more that the customer is motivated by curiosity, the more likely they are to buy science books that are co-purchased with left-wing books. The more that they're interested in science books from the standpoint of problem solving, applied science, more pragmatic science, they're more likely to co-purchase with conservative books. That holds pretty well. I think the only real exception might be history, but otherwise, really, it does explain it pretty well, I think. Now, there's a lot of purple there in the middle, and that might seem like it makes a nice bridge between left and right, but when we dig a little deeper into specific disciplines and subdisciplines, what we find is that they're internally polarized. So yeah, within the area of climatology, there are a lot of co-purchases with both conservative and liberal books in about equal numbers, but it's not the same books. And you notice the conservative books are sort of on the periphery of the network, which means they're tied into just a few books in climatology, whereas the liberal books are more diffused within climatology. Same thing for books on evolution, similar pattern. Internal polarization, the conservative books, the books co-purchased with conservative books are more on the periphery of the books on evolution. So that's measurement, not a whole lot of explanation. But let's now turn from measurement to explanation. And here I think that at the end of the day, let's face it, it's pretty hard to beat randomized trials when you're trying to explain something. Control away all those potential confounds, isolate the factor, see if it produces the effect. And virtual labs are a new opportunity to be able to do this even at population scale, and certainly with much bigger and more diverse participant pools than what we've had in the past, where you have 20, 19-year-olds coming in, college sophomores from the intro psych class. So here's a study that I did with Milena Tsvetkova. At that time, she was a student in my lab. And it's on the idea of pay it forward. You may have seen the movie. This idea that you help a stranger and they help someone else. And so we had an online experiment on Amazon Mechanical Turk, an online labor market. We had nearly 600 participants, and they had an option to donate part of their earnings anonymously to a future participant, a stranger. And some people could receive those donations, and others could only observe. And we also ran the flip side, a second experiment, in which instead of pay it forward, it's steal it forward. So it's exactly the same study, but now you could take from another participant. You could take some of their earnings and keep it for yourself. So what were the questions? Well, we wanted to know first, will people pay it forward, and will they steal it forward? Will they take it forward? And is antisocial behavior just as contagious as prosocial behavior? And what's the mechanism? Is it generalized reciprocity? Is it a feeling of obligation because you've been helped, or a feeling of getting even because you've been hurt? Or is it just conformity to an emergent norm from the observation of what others are doing? So here are the results. And what we found is that when it was gifts that were received, that the recipients of gifts were in fact more likely to give. And the recipients of theft, the victims, were even more likely to take. So the contagious effect of taking was much stronger, actually, than the contagious effect of giving, but both were contagious. On the other hand, observing really had a very different effect. It had a negative effect in the case of giving. The people who observed giving without themselves receiving were actually less likely to donate. A sort of, let George do it. I see other people doing it. They don't need my donation. I'll just keep it for myself. Thank you very much. And when we came to the theft experiment, they were no more likely to take. And in fact, the people who observed honesty were less likely to take. So for the most part, observation doesn't have much of a play or much of an effect in this story. It's mostly the people who are receiving either the gift or the loss. So the take-home message, and Nicholas Christakis is right here, and really the person who I think did as much as anyone to set the stage for this experiment and for the idea that I want to leave you with, and that is, when you help someone and when you hurt them, you need to think downstream, because you're not going to just help that person, but you're going to help the people that they are now more likely to help. But the same thing holds when you screw somebody, when you take advantage. They're now even more likely to take advantage of someone else. So it's something I think to keep in mind when you're calculating whether what are the consequences of my action. You have to think downstream. So it's an experimental test of the 3 degrees idea that Nicholas and James introduced. So I want to conclude by suggesting that computational social science is really transformative social science, that it's really changing the face of social science in fundamental ways. That when we're looking at interactions, we used to just focus on the interactions among variables like education, occupation, income, gender, ethnicity. And we can still do that, but we now also look at the interactions among actors, how people interact, not just variables. Our explanations used to be highly atomistic, as if everybody thinks for yourself, you're on an island with no neighbors, no colleagues, no friends, no peers. It's all from within. And now we can still do that. We can have those atomistic explanations, but we also have the data. We don't just have to look within. We can also situate those individual explanations within a relational context. The outcomes, we can still look at equilibrium, but now with computational models, we can look at the dynamics out of equilibrium. The networks, we can still have random networks, we can still have complete networks, but now we can also have complex networks, which we have not had much in the past. Experiments, not just with college sophomores, but now on a global basis and with millions of people. Observations, we can still have retrospective self-reports from surveys, but to that we now also have measures of real-time behavior. And when you add all that up together, that's a transformative picture, I think, of social science and a bright future ahead. So we'll end with that. I'm happy to take some questions. I think we have a few minutes for... Yes?
I'll just ask you about the end of theory.
Uh-huh.
The question is on the end of theory, and if there are policy consequences for that. Because when I look at senior decision makers in the government, they've kind of gone from big data, and then the term that they were using was narrative. And to me, narrative is like a structure that helps them understand and put that big data into context. Do you agree?
Well, you know, I would strongly recommend an entire book on that question by Duncan Watts, who is one of our speakers. It's called Everything is Obvious. And it's a book about the dangers of using intuition to guide our research. Physicists don't do that because their intuition about behavior doesn't tell them very much about the behavior of particles. Social scientists fall victim to this all the time, including people in government, but also academia. We imagine we're one of the people we're studying, and we use our intuition to explain their behavior. An entire book with case after case of how you get into deep trouble when you try to do that. Yes?
Can you say a little bit more about the equilibrium dynamics aspect, Michael? Because the talk was more on less the dynamics, and I was just wondering what you think about the dynamic aspects of the whole thing.
Yeah, so in other studies that I've done, we've done more work with computational modeling and agent-based modeling. And in those studies, we typically find the equilibrium at the very beginning because that helps us to know what the possibilities are. But then what we study are not those endpoints, but the dynamics of change from some starting point. Might be random, or it might be an equilibrium that we disturb. And what we find in these situations is that there are often many equilibria, and that the equilibria are not especially informative because even in the case where there's only one equilibrium, there's no guarantee you'll ever be there. The guarantee is only that if you do get there, you will stay there forever. That's all it means. And there's no guarantee that you'll ever even arrive there. So mostly what we wanted to know what the equilibria are and where they are, what does the landscape look like. But then what we wanted to find out is how does the system change over time. And we've used that to study a number of problems, including cascade dynamics as thresholds rise as they go up, where people they need social reinforcement to be able to act. And so we examined that. We looked at models of unpopular norms, where people enforce behaviors that they themselves don't want to do and they don't want anyone else to do. And that is an equilibrium, but we wanted to see under what conditions a population can arrive there. So those are a couple of examples from some of my studies that, I didn't get into today.
Michael, as we understand more about crime and conflict and many other things, revolutions maybe, I see a dual use problem over here. Can you comment a little bit about this?
Can you just elaborate just a bit?
Well, I'm getting worried that the kind of knowledge we're creating might be used by politics in ways that are not necessarily positive, but also to destabilize certain kind of countries or societies. And what can we do in order to avoid such a thing?
Yeah, I don't do a lot of policy work, so I'm really not the person to speak knowledgeably about policy and policy implications. But I agree that big data are both a great opportunity for science, but they're also a great opportunity for policy, either for good or for evil. Whether it's helping a social movement overthrow an oppressive regime, or whether it's socking us with advertising to manipulate our consumption package, or whether it's to suppress that same revolution or social movement. So it can be used by all sides. Do we therefore not go down that route? I don't think so. I think we still pursue our understanding of how things work. We do have to take some responsibility for the consequences and for the policy implications. And for sure, there are issues of privacy, security that are immense in the era of big data. And I think it's an important question, an important problem. It's not a new problem, though. I mean, the issues of privacy and security and the misuses of science and technology for evil purposes, that's been around for as long as we've had civilization. So it's not a new problem, but it's an important one. Lada has a question.
So I was wondering if you could speculate about what would happen if you had friends in the pay it forward experiment. So you talked about how important it is to look at things in a relational way, but when you plug individuals, I mean, pay it forward is a thing that you can do with strangers, but just curious what.
Right. So we deliberately did not want to have friends there because we wanted to remove any opportunity for self-interest to play a part. So I will help a friend thinking, okay, sometime I'm going to need their help. So my neighbor, while I'm here actually in Finland, there's nobody home at my house. So the neighbor will look in, and when they're away, we'll look in on their house. So there's that sort of reciprocity that's direct. We wanted to study what's called generalized reciprocity. And it's a different version of reciprocity, but it's still reciprocity. So now I help you, and now in response, you're going to help, but you're not going to help me. You're going to help somebody else downstream. So we had to create that environment therefore, we couldn't have friends in order to be able to do that. We thought that was the sort of the more interesting problem, and that was the original problem of Pay It Forward, was to help a stranger. So that was why we did that. But it would be an interesting study to have that in a context of direct reciprocity, where you can literally pay back the person who helped you.
So maybe we can wrap up there. So
Okay.
this is something from the conference and from Aalto University for speaking here.
Great, thank you.
Which one can I take?
So you need this?
Yes, first of all, put this one.
Okay, our next speaker is Jure Leskovec, who is an assistant professor of computer science at Stanford. He is also affiliated with, I think, the Jožef Stefan Institute in Slovenia. He also is involved in, I think, several educational nonprofits and then a for-profit startup, which has since been acquired. In any case, he's full of energy. And yesterday I found out that the reason why he doesn't drink much coffee is because he might become even more energetic. So you'll be able to observe this firsthand in the talk. You might see him bouncing like this. Sometimes he'll roll up his sleeves. His sleeves are pre-rolled up, so watch out.
Okay. Good. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Santo, for organizing this great event. So I changed my talk a bit, and what I want to talk to you about today is thinking how can we learn from human behaviors, about them from digital traces, and in particular, how can we motivate humans to do stuff for us. Okay? And when I think about motivation, I really think about how can we motivate participation and contribution. And, how do we create, in some sense, stimulate people to be active, to contribute to the community, to the society. And there are many examples of these types of behaviors, or where we would want to stimulate this participation or contribution, right? We can think of many of the settings that are happening on the web, where the community is trying to organize themselves for people to contribute. You can think about Wikipedia. The other question that you can think about as motivation and contribution is, how do we recognize different levels of achievement or different levels of contribution? And for example, we as scientists, we have many different ways to recognize people's achievements or contributions to the community. And you can think of those in terms of grants we give to each other, awards we give to each other, publications we give to each other. And I'm showing some medals because, for example, Army and other organizations like that are also using some mechanisms to allow to kind of stimulate people to contribute and participate in whatever they are doing. So really, the question is, how should we think about these things, right? And there are several different ways, several different kind of frameworks that come into play here, right? So the first one is thinking about social psychological theories of engagement and participation, and how can you kind of apply those to online communities and online social networks. You can also think about how do we build mechanisms, basically doing game theoretic research, mechanism design, in terms to encouraging quality of contribution. Right? Kind of what should be the incentive structure that stimulates people to produce, let's say, high quality products or accomplishments. And then we can also think about kind of more broadly about how do we design contents, right? Or contents. And then the last one, how do we think about mechanisms of distributed recruitment? How do we kind of make people come and participate in whatever we are doing? For example, the DARPA Balloon Challenge was one such example where distributed recruiting was used to gather information about what's going on with these red balloons all over United States. Okay? So really what I want to talk to you about today is two studies about how do we think about motivating human behaviors. And in particular, the first part will be about online discussion forums, right? Where basically we can ask, how can we use various types of mechanisms to encourage quality of online discussion, right? And online discussion forums, if you go there and read those comments, that's kind of the worst of the humanity. And the question is, can we do anything to make it better there? And really what I will try to go is really try to understand what kind of mechanisms can we use and try to develop basically causal models that allow us to say what should we do in each case to make things go better. And in particular, in the case of online discussion forums, we'll think about how do we provide people with feedback about how well they are doing in the community. So that will be the first part. And then the second part will actually be a very different domain. It will be education, and it will be massive open online courses, where we'll be asking, how do I motivate students to participate more? Right? And that's a question as a professor, as a teacher, you're asking in some sense every day, right? Should you give away free chocolate or what should you do, right? And here what we will be thinking about is how do we create incentives for students to change their, let's say, preferred behavior, whatever preferred is, okay? So that's the plan for the talk. So the first thing I want to ask is really this question about how people react to feedback they receive. And in some sense, how does positive or negative evaluation of a person influence their future subsequent behavior? And the way we want to think about this is we'll think of this as online discussion forums. We have humans contribute some content, and this content can be positively or negatively evaluated by others casting votes on that. And the question is, what does that do to the author's future behavior? And of course you could ask, these kind of evaluations, this kind of feedback, does it help or does it kind of make things worse? And you could think, why would it help, right? Why would people improve by receiving feedback? And there's kind of very nice theoretical framework of operant conditioning theory, where you can really think about basically that this feedback provides some kind of reward and punishment stimuli, right? And if I kind of reward you, it's almost like training a dog, right? A dog learns when the dog is positive rewarded, and also kind of the human learns when they are negatively rewarded and try to change the behavior to kind of get away from negative rewards, right? So that's one thing to think about this. The other way to think about this is that actually this kind of feedback could make people get worse, in a sense that feedback would have negative effects because people given only positive feedback tend to be complacent, and kind of bad impressions by giving people negative feedback are quicker to form, and they are kind of more resistant to disconfirmation, right? So the question is, which one of the two is at work in the particular domain we'll study? So what we will be looking at is online social media sites, where basically people provide, or users provide, feedback about each other. And this is kind of all over the web, right? All over the web, social media sites allow us to vote on the content, give thumbs up, give thumbs down, assign stars to things, and things like that, right? And the question is, what kind of feedback loops are this type of feedback mechanisms causing in these online communities, and how are they modulating or affecting the behavior? So the question in some sense is, when users evaluate each other, and these evaluations create feedback effects that in a long run dynamically can affect the whole community, right? And the question is, can we understand what is going on? And in particular, we'll be looking at online discussion forums, and online discussion forums in particular that are related to news sites, right? So here's an example of a CNN article, and what I want to bring to your attention is that below the main article, people can write and post comments, right? So this would be down here, right? And what does that mean is that as users come to the site, discussions can evolve where people post comments, and then other people can come and vote on those comments. They can basically give a thumbs up or they can give a thumbs down, right? And then the discussion can evolve. Every person, you see who the author is, and you also see what was in this case number of upvotes or downloads that this person received, right? And basically what we want to understand is, how do these votes that people receive, how do they modulate future behavior? And what we will be studying is complete data from, in this case, we just picked 4 random discussion websites that we found on the web. We worked with a company that's providing the commenting service to them, so we have complete data in terms of comments, we have complete data in terms of votes and everything else. So overall, we have 1.2 million articles, around 1.8 million registered users, 42 million different posts, and around 140 million votes across 4 different websites over a 1-year period. We will be looking at CNN.com, IGN, which is International Gamers Network. So this is kind of a website devoted to computer games, where people post articles and then discuss them. We'll talk to, the third site is Breitbart.com, which is a political discussion website. And the last one is All K-pop. So this is Korean pop music website. Again, articles, discussions, votes, and basically all these sites have the same infrastructure, it's just the topic is different. And everything I'll show generalizes across all these different domains. Okay, so the question is, how does positive or negative feedback, so basically the votes people receive, how does that influence their future behavior? And if we think about that, there are several different types of behavior that can get influenced through these votes. So the first one is in terms of post quality, right? How good content do you write? Then we'll try to separate this out from what I'll call community bias, which is basically how do people perceive you, right? Are you perceived as a good contributor, and then just by default you get good votes? Then we'll also look at the posting frequency, right? How often do people come back based on the feedback they receive? And also how basically this idea that Michael was saying about, pay it forward. Whatever feedback you receive, how does that influence the feedback you give further forward to the others? And of course, the way I'm talking about this is basically what I would really like to understand is this kind of notion that I have a person, the person is posting some comments, and then somehow I kind of treat them with a positive evaluation, or I treat them with a negative evaluation. And what I'd like to say is what will happen to them in the future after a positive or a negative evaluation. And really what I'm kind of asking here is, I would want to do a randomized controlled trial. And in this case, these things are hard to do, but what is nice in some sense is that nature is doing these experiments for us, right? And given that we have lots and lots of data, what we can do is we can find pairs of people that are practically indistinguishable in all their aspects, but for some reason one got evaluated positively and one got evaluated negatively. So what we will do is we will match pairs of people based on their posting frequency, length of text, and we'll be matching this on the 3 posts before the post that either got positively and negatively evaluated, and we'll be asking what happens in the subsequent 3 posts of that particular user. Okay? So what I'm doing is I will take pairs of users where one got a positive evaluation, one got a negative evaluation. Positive and negative means high fraction of positive votes. Negative means low fraction of positive votes, and we'll match this based on their activity before the evaluation in terms of the text quality, number of votes they receive, overall proportion of upvotes, their activity, and everything else. And when I use this notion of text quality, what we will actually do is we will apply mechanical Turk and ask some people to evaluate how good quality is a given post. And then we'll train a machine learning model that will, for any given piece of text, tell us how good quality is that given piece of text. Okay, so now I can talk about this kind of objective notion of the quality of the contribution. And the first question is, right, how do I now separate out the parts of votes that a user receives because they provided a good or a bad quality contribution, which is basically versus the other one, which is whether the community likes or dislikes that person. Okay, so I could have down voting or up voting because of the post content, or I could have up voting or down voting because the community dislikes the particular author, right? And I want to disentangle these two effects away. So the way we will do this is first we'll just look at the raw text quality using this machine learning idea that I was saying about. And what we find here is that basically the text quality significantly drops after a negative evaluation, but basically does not change after a positive evaluation, right? So basically people who do well, if you give them up votes, they'll keep doing the same. If you give people negative votes, they'll actually do worse in the future. Of course, you can also ask, this is at the level of text quality, what about the perception of the community? Is there kind of an additional penalty that people that receive negative feedback receive because the community learns who they are and penalizes them further? The way we can get to that is the following. Basically what we can do is, for a given post, we know the number of upvotes and the number of downloads the post has, but then we also know what is its text quality. And the way we can get to this notion of community bias is we basically ask, what's the difference in the fraction of upvotes a post received versus what's our predicted text quality? What is our predicted number of upvotes or downloads based just only on the text of the the article. And based from this residual, from this error, we can kind of attribute that difference to the effect of the community, basically by them learning who the person is, right? So in this case, I would say the community bias is 0.1, right? So this person wrote a piece of text that should have 80% of upvotes. At the end, we see 90, so that 10% difference will attribute to the community. And the question is there anything systematic going on with respect to these residuals that we are computing? And what we will do is we'll compare the community bias before the evaluation and after the evaluation to see what's the effect of the evaluation itself. And what's interesting is that basically posts made after the negative evaluation were perceived worse than those made after the positive evaluation. And the effect is quite striking. So for example, on CNN, on average, your posts are being evaluated 48% worse than they would be based just on the text quality. So the community learns who bad contributors are, and they get kind of punished twice. First for the content, and the second time because who they are. So just to summarize kind of what do we know so far about motivating contributions in online forums, we motivate those by providing people feedback through upvotes or downvotes. And the way we are thinking about this is the following. I have two people that are indistinguishable from each other, but they are writing same quality text, same amount of contribution, same number of upvotes, everything is kind of the same, but then one of them gets positively evaluated and one of them gets negatively evaluated. And the question is what happens after the evaluation. And what we find is that first, people who get a positive evaluation, their text quality is about the same. People who get a negative evaluation, their text quality is significantly worse. Both it's worse from people that are positively evaluated, and it's also worse from what they were doing before the evaluation. I try to denote this by stars. And that's what's interesting is actually there is an additional kind of penalty, is that people that receive positive evaluation, they get a small non-statistically significant boost in their upvotes, while people who are negatively evaluated, they receive a huge kind of statistically significant downgrade of the votes they receive. Okay, so that's the first thing. Is basically this feedback that we have, these voting mechanisms in online forums seem to be kind of creating people to write worse content, not better content. Of course, what you could think is to say maybe this feedback allows people to understand that they are not welcome here and they should go away, right? So what I mean by that is maybe this feedback modulates the posting frequency, right? That people who receive positive feedback, they feel happier and come back, and people who receive negative feedback, they kind of go away. Right? So in some sense that feedback, rather than regulating quality, does it regulate quantity? And what we'll be doing is very simple. Again, we have this post that got positively or negatively evaluated, and we are comparing the frequency before the evaluation and after the evaluation. And what's interesting here is basically the following, is that if you are providing positive feedback, the frequency increases, but if you are providing negative feedback to people, the frequency increases even more. So basically, people that get negatively evaluated, they show up more, not less, right? And basically what this says is don't feed the trolls, right? Kind of don't even provide any feedback to these people because they'll come back. And then maybe the last question is, what about evaluations people receive, right? It's kind of paid forward, right? So how about their voting behavior? How do they kind of transfer these votes to the other, right? So the feedback, does it result in subsequent backlash in a sense that people who receive negative votes, do they also then give negative votes to the others? And what you find is that actually the same is true. So people, the green line is before and after are people who receive positive votes or positive evaluations, a negative line is people who receive negative evaluations. And on the positive side, you see no statistical significant difference. And on the side of negative evaluations, you see a relatively strong negative effect, statistically significant. So it's around 5% drop in the probability of giving a positive vote after receiving a negative evaluation. So it seems basically everything that we know, the summary so far says the following, is basically that the effects of negative feedback are much more pronounced than the effects of the positive feedback, in a sense that negatively evaluated users of these forums write more, they write worse, and they themselves are evaluated worse by the community, and they give worse evaluations to others in the community. And then it seems that positively evaluated users, on the other hand, don't do any better. Okay? So what does this say? Basically, this seems to be saying that all these online discussion communities are going on this deep downward spiral, right, from this kind of microscopic analysis I showed so far. So the question is, what's happening on the macro scale? Here is an example of CNN.com from January to August. Y-axis is proportion of downvotes. It went from around 19% downvotes to about 22% downvotes. And as the community is growing over time, it goes from 0.8 million downvotes to around 1.7 million downvotes. And this is not just happening on CNN, it's actually happening everywhere. So basically these communities are getting more negative as a function of time. So basically all these microscopic mechanisms we identified are leading to the increases in negative behavior. So the next question in this case is really how should we change interaction mechanisms in these communities to prevent these kinds of downward spirals? That's one piece of future work. And the other piece is really, can we now build tools that detect these bad users quickly, and maybe we are able to remove them from the community. So the question is, can we identify these types of antisocial behavior quickly and prevent downward spirals, right? So basically, can we identify trolls in these communities quickly? And what's interesting is that actually we can do. After just seeing about 10 posts of a person, we can reliably predict whether the person is going to be blocked from the community in the future. And if users are doing this with, let's say, 0.75 accuracy or AUC, the machine is able to do this with 0.83. So we are basically able to do these things better than human evaluators or human moderators are able to do in terms of deciding who's destructive to the discussions in those communities. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to say about online forums and how votes here create feedback loops that modify behaviors. The story is a bit worrying, but still we are modifying behaviors one way or another. Okay, so now what about trying to think differently, and actually rather than trying to provide feedback to people, what if we try to create incentives for them to change their behavior? Okay, so now I'll think about, can I create incentives in these communities for people to switch what they are doing? And in particular, the mechanism, the incentive we will be looking at is this notion of badges, right? And badges are really everywhere, right? Napoleon said, give me enough medals and I will win you any war. So army operates solely on badges. If you think about online communities, for example, Wikipedia is giving the people, the editors who make big contributions, they receive badges. Online sites like Stack Overflow, Foursquare, and so on are giving their users badges for the contributions. Khan Academy, which is an online educational website, is giving their students badges. Again, as I was saying before, in science, you can think we have various types of badges from grants, awards, publications, things like that. Okay? So badges are really very common, and what's interesting about them is because they have these two effects, right? They both kind of serve as incentives, but they also serve as credentials, right? Somebody with lots of badges, they have status in the community. On the other hand, badges also create incentives for people to go and try to get them. Okay? So the question is, if I have these kind of badges, these kinds of rewards in the system, that what kind of effects do they have on human behavior? And what I'll do here is first I'll show you some utility-based kind of game theoretic model of user behavior. Then I'll show you some historical data analysis, and then I'll actually show an example of an A/B test of a randomized trial where we implemented these badges in an online course and saw what happens to human behavior after half of the course has badges and half doesn't. Okay, so in terms of the data set I'll be thinking about for this part of the talk, I'll be thinking about Stack Overflow, which is the world's largest question answering website, and it's mostly for programmers to ask and answer questions. And I'm sure whenever you had a programming question, if you type it to Google, there's already an answer on Stack Overflow, right? And we are working again with complete data, complete site dynamics from the site inception till the end, around 2 million people, 5 million questions, and then every question can receive up or down votes, so we had around 10 million votes. Okay? And on this website, basically there are 4 things you can do. You can ask a question, you can answer a question, and then you can either vote on a question or you can vote on an answer, basically saying, this is a good question, this is a good answer. Okay, so let's now just think about kind of how would I go and model or think about this process of people doing actions on the website and then receiving rewards or badges for doing certain types of actions. The way we think of this is we'll think of this as an action space, right? So I'll think of of various types of actions people can do on the site. Imagine now that on this site, in this environment, a person can do two actions. They can do an action of type A1 or they can do an action of type A2. And every user, they will start down here in the bottom left corner. And then as they are making actions, they're basically moving across the cells of this through this space. Basically, whenever they make an action of type A1, they make a step to the right. And whenever they make an action of type A2, they make a step up, right? So every user is basically like a monotonic trajectory in this action space, right? In case of Stack Overflow, this is a 4-dimensional space. And now I can ask, what are badges in this space? Badges are nothing else than boundaries. These boundaries can be axis aligned or not, it doesn't really matter. And basically they say that once you cross this boundary, you will get this badge, you will get this reward, right? And in our case, badges basically don't cost anything. It's just something you put next to the person's profile. It's a little image. That's all the badge is, okay? So these are now the badges. They are basically intervals in this or half planes in this space that once you cross them, you receive the badge. Okay? And then there are two more components to the model. So there are the parts to the model is now how do I incorporate user and what the user wants. And basically the way we'll think about this is the following, is that whenever a user gains the badge, they gain some value from getting that badge. But we'll think of the users also the following way. We'll think that every user is born with some preferred behavior, right? It's basically a vector in the direction of which I like walking, right? So for example, for this particular case here, this person really likes making actions of type A2 and they don't like making actions of type A1 too much, right? So their preferred trajectory or direction of moving is up there, right? But now what you could imagine is because there is a badge here to the right, what the user will want to do is they will want to shift their behavior. They will want to switch from what they are doing to get to the badge sooner and to enjoy it in some sense quicker, right? But what will be the second part is that kind of it will hurt to change the behavior, right? Kind of deviating from your preferred behavior, from what you were kind of born to like doing, is hard. It's like exercising is hard, right? So now the user has kind of two things to do. They want to minimize how much they deviate from their preferred behavior, but they also want to go to the badges quicker. And what you can do basically, you can write down the utility-based model where just kind of intuitively you say the user's utility of taking a particular action is the sum of the badges they have won so far, plus whatever is their future utility after making that particular action, plus minus some term that says how much are they deviating from their preferred distribution over actions. So basically, how much are they steering away from what the user likes to do. And now, given that we have this kind of utility-based model, we can actually go and solve it. And when I say solve, it really means we can figure out what is the optimal for a user to do in any of these cells, right? Given the positions of badges and given the user's preferred behavior, we can now compute what is the optimal thing for the user to do in a given state so that their overall utility is maximized, okay? And what's interesting, if you actually go and run these models, you find that these badges, at least from the simulation, seem to act like, in some sense, like magnets, right? What I'm trying to show you here is we have these two types of actions. We have two badges, and the arrows show the direction in which people would be moving, right? And what is interesting, you see this notion of steering as they're kind of get closer to the badge boundary, the more towards the boundary they are moving. And what also seems to be predicted by the model is that after the person gets across the badge boundary, they basically forget about that and they just kind of myopically start to go to the next badge, right? You see here how quickly the behavior changes up, and the same above. The other thing you notice is that the arrows get longer as they get closer to the badge. What this means is that people are not just shifting the direction in which they are moving, but they are also increasing their overall activity. Basically, the frequency at which they are performing actions seems to be increasing. Okay, so this is the model simulation. This is now in 2 dimensions. I can do everything on a single dimension, where now the x-axis is, you can think of it as time. Here I'm measuring time in numbers of types of actions A1 that the person has done. And then the y-axis is probability. And what you see is that very far from the badge, there's no effect. Here, the user really likes doing action A3, and the action A1 has a very low probability. But as the user approaches closer to the badge boundary, you see how the frequency or the probability of taking action type A1 is increasing at the expense of the other 2 actions. Okay, so this is what's predicted by the model. And what's interesting, if you go into the data, you see exactly the same thing. So this is now a real Stack Overflow badge. This is called an electorate badge. You win it if you vote on 600 questions, right? So you have to go to 600 questions, and you have to press a vote button on each one of them. Right? And what I'm showing you here is 4 types of actions. X-axis is the time. 0 is the time when users receive the badge. So before 0 is before you receive the badge, after you receive the badge. Actions are, these are answers, questions, and then it's the question votes and answer votes. And what you see is that the first observation you see is this increase of question votes as people get close to the badge boundary, and then kind of an immediate drop basically back to the baseline level. That's the first observation. The second observation is that the increase in the question voting actually goes at the expense of answer voting, right? So the yellow line decreases a bit, while the asking questions and answering them stays flat over time. And then the last thing is, if you sum these curves together, that gives you the overall activity of the person on the website. And here you see that the overall activity is increasing around the badge boundary. What's interesting is that basically it drops down right after the badge boundary. So kind of humans don't learn, if you want to think of it that way. Okay? This is just kind of one example. But what is now interesting is, because we have the model, I can now, a website designer can come to me and say, I want to stimulate this type of behavior. What should be the reward system I implement in this website, right? So in some sense, where should I place the rewards? Where should I place the badges to get the desired effects, to basically get the desired effects in the human behavior? So I can now go and algorithmically decide where to put these badges. And what we did here is actually we worked with Coursera, which is a Stanford startup around massive open online courses, or MOOCs. And we worked with the class called machine learning. That's by my colleague at the computer science department, Andrew Ng. And he was running this class several times. So we had 3 instances of this class. It's around 60,000 students for the first 2 instances and 110,000 students for the last instance. And what we did in the last instance of the class, we actually went and implemented the badges. So we basically started giving people rewards for the participation on the forum. So we asked Andrew, what would you like us to do with your students? And he says, I think it's very important for them to participate on the forum, so let's stimulate them to participate on the forum, right? So we used the framework I just talked to design and deploy the badge system on the machine learning number 3. Okay? So the question is, what kind of behavioral effects did this have on the students? And just to give you an idea how this worked, we had different types of badges for reading the forum, for voting on posts. So this was basically types of badges that encourage people to read and for people to vote. And then the other types of badges were basically trying to recognize high quality achievements. This was by saying how many posts have you written that have received lots of upvotes? How many good questions have you asked? Right, so we wanted to stimulate reading activity, voting activity. We didn't want to stimulate people asking lots of questions or giving lots of answers, but we wanted to stimulate giving good answers or asking good questions. And then every badge came in 4 different levels: bronze, silver, gold, and diamond. Okay, so I'll just show you one quick result. Here, what I'm showing you is the distribution of the number of votes versus fraction of users, and the number of posts they read as a fraction of users. And this is done over 3 runs of the machine learning course, right? So I have the first 2 runs of the course, and then the last 3rd run that actually had the badges implemented. And because everything is normalized, there are no size effects. But what you basically see, for example, in terms of voting and reading, we are getting about 5 times increase in the number of people that had at least 100 votes or they read at least 100 reads. And you see that basically, even though this is not now an experiment, it's observational, but you see that the first 2 instances of the course that had no badges, basically there's no statistical difference between them, while the course that had badges had kind of much more activity in the tail. This is for voting and reading, but what now this asks a question is, did you just increase the overall activity on the site, or did you increase activity in a targeted way? So what we actually can look is also, what about just the raw number of posts or the raw number of comments, and what you can see is that those didn't really change. Right? So what this basically means is that the dimensions on which we added badges had a big increase in the engagement, and the dimensions or actions that we didn't incentivize, they basically remained unchanged. So what does this mean is that basically using these badges, we can steer human behaviors in very targeted ways. Okay? So let me just conclude. What I was trying to talk to you about today was thinking about, how could I go and motivate human behaviors in various types of communities, right? And first, we were thinking about how could I provide humans with feedback about how well they're doing. And an instance of this was in terms of people voting on each other in online discussion forums. And what was interesting here is that basically the effects of negative feedback are much more pronounced than those of positive feedback. But then what we saw in the second part was thinking about badges as incentives for modifying human behavior, and basically thinking about how can we effectively steer people towards desired behaviors. Right? There are lots of connections and lots of very interesting questions and analogies with offline domains, really thinking about how evaluation, for example, works in scientific communities, how are we deciding to accept papers to conferences and journals, how are we funding grant proposals, how do we decide who gets hired, who receives awards, and so on. And really, what are some interesting questions to be asking about here is to think about, in what ways can rewards and feedback change the behavior and the dynamics of communities, right? And for example, here I was just doing this kind of global analysis, but really the question is, how could we model mixtures of motivations and incentives in the same system? Right? How does this how is long-term planning affected in the presence of competition, right? So I was talking to you about badges, and badges are nice because there's in some sense no competition. There's no scarcity for the badges. Everyone can get them, right? And also thinking about how can we build these systems in an adaptive way that kind of incentives have the effects we want them to have. That would be interesting. So with that, I'm done. Happy to take questions. Thank you.
Hi.
Sure. Can somebody stand up, whoever is asking? There are 2 people there. Yeah, sure.
Does it work? Hi. Very nice talk. I'm wondering, how does it change the knowledge of when you reach the knowledge of how you can reach a badge on when you don't know if you're going to reach a badge?
Good question. So maybe what you are really asking is, so what we also did, I didn't talk about this, is the question is, where do the badges get their value from? Right? So in some sense, is it important, do you, for example, and you could think of several different ways, right? You could think that the value of the badge is transactional, right? I let you know you won the badge and you feel good. Another option is that I show others the badges you got, so the value of the badge is social. Right? And then the last one is that I really keep you informed, and I say, hey, if you do 5 more actions of this type, you will win the badge in the future. And what turns out is that letting people know what's the goal and how many more steps do they need to get to reach that goal, that had the highest behavioral effect. What we saw is that this kind of the social effect of these badges, in a sense that if you use these badges to to boast yourself in front of the others, or allow you to see what badges others have, that had slight effect, but the p-value I think was 0.6 or something like that. So sorry, 0.06. And then, so in terms of, is it important to let people know? Yeah, it's definitely important. And it's not so important to let them know that they won the badge. It seems it's more important to let them know that they can win a badge, or how far away from the badge they are. So kind of telling them how far they are in the progress to get to it, that had the biggest effect. So that's kind of the answer. All right, good, thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I've got a question on your first research, and it concerns the quality measurement of the text. So your model, your machine learning model, is based on human coders so far as I understood, right? So, and there is a number of questions. So first, who these humans are, and how do they know that what is the perceived quality of the text in this particular community, and and what's the point of like measuring one kind of voting against the other kind of voting, because these coders also vote. And the second part of the question is about the scale. When you work with big data, once you introduce human coding, this becomes a very narrow bottleneck that through which you can only get the results on your big data, because you can't do a lot of human coding, like as much as you get online data. And how did you solve this problem? How much coding you could do, and how did you solve the problem of human subjectivity?
Sure, great questions. We spent quite some time and thought in terms of thinking about this coding, but here are a few things we did. So the first thing we did, we said the following. We said, so one thing you can do is to say, I will just build a model that tries to predict the fraction of positive votes of a post based on the text of the post. Okay, so whatever is the bias in that fraction doesn't matter, because you are saying, I'll just look at the text signals and I'll try to regress what's the fraction of positive votes you received. So that was the first approach, right? And because I'm just using the text, I cannot really model the community bias. So that should kind of get lost in the noise, and it gets lost in the noise. So you can do this without any human evaluation. So you could just say, I'll take the text and I want to predict what fraction of upvotes will you receive, and because I'm only using it doing the text, I'm basically learning the text quality, because there's no other no other feature that goes in trying to make the prediction about the fraction. So that's the first thing we tried. And then, of course, the reviewers were a bit grumpy, so we went and did the mechanical Turk, right? Mechanical Turk is always your friend. So who is there? The way I know is Americans and Indians. So this is, our evaluators. And we were asking them, we would show them just a single post, and we would ask them, on a scale on 0 to 1, or not even that. We just asked them, do you think, is this post of a good quality or a bad quality? Would you enjoy reading this response on some forum? And we just showed them the post itself. And for every post, I think we collected between 10 and 20 votes. We did this, I think, for several thousand of these posts. Again, it's very easy to do this with Mechanical Turk. And then again, we said the same thing. Let's use just the text to predict this fraction of now just the upvotes. And when we showed the content of the post, we of course hide the identity and everything. So those were the two ways we got to this, and the results were robust whether you do it one way or another. So what is to say, in some sense, Mechanical Turk, is great, and I think Duncan and others have used it a lot, right? It's easy. You pay a couple $100 or $1,000 and you get lots of people to label things for you. What you have to be careful there is how do you ask questions and how do you design the task. So that then becomes the art. But we tried to do it both ways and didn't make a difference. Good question. Sure.
I was just curious, have you thought at all about how you might have social norms evolve in these systems that can sort of break the reward structure you create? So like on Twitter, for example, there's a norm that if someone follows you, you follow them back, whether or not you have any sort of positive evaluation of that person. And you can imagine similar things. So I'm imagining in these online courses, maybe just a social norm evolves where you just upvote everything, and that totally breaks the system. I'm just curious, have you thought about how you would detect these sorts of things, or what the implications might be, or anything like that? I think that's a great question about thinking about social norms, because maybe one way to think about those is, in some sense, I was explicitly messing up with the community, either through creating incentives or providing explicit feedback. But you could imagine that you could try to seed the community with a certain norm, right? Like you bring in the user and do some kind of education at the beginning to hope to bootstrap the whole process.
that we haven't thought in those ways, but I think that would be very, very interesting if you could now create separate parallel worlds and see how can you influence the users even kind of when they come in, how do you onboard them in a sense. So that'd be super cool.
Thank you for the great talk. I have two questions about your first part of the talk. So the first one is the effect that you see after the negative feedback is, I suppose it should be transient, right? So it will go back to whatever their normal state was before. Because otherwise similarity becomes very difficult to interpret. So basically when we say,
this is not transient, right?
okay, so that brings me to my comment that if we're not assuming that the behavior is transient, then if we suppose that two users are similar initially, it means that their default mode have been the same, and they have received exact same number of positive and negative votes up to that point, which is very unlikely.
Great point. So what you have to be careful with is also accounting for the amount of user activity or for the user age, so that kind of everyone basically has the same history up to that defining moment when they separate out. Because you have this kind of long range or long-term effects where everything seems to be spiraling. And of course, what then these websites did, I think CNN now turned off voting, many of these websites turned off comments, everyone is trying to do something because of these things. Mm-hmm. Right, so they are trying to figure out what's going on.
Okay, and the second question is, so did you observe any kind of like heterogeneous behavior in terms of, so those who receive negative feedback, whether they become more active, or intuitively you would think some people would go away, but some would,
People that receive negative feedback are more active.
Yes, but so are they heterogeneous in that sense? So are there like those who receive negative feedback, so are there a subgroup of them who go away and some of them become overly active that like on average captures that?
That's a good question. We haven't looked into that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Good.
Thanks again.
Thank you. Great, thank you.
Okay, so our next speaker is Omar Guerrero from the Institute for Economic Thinking at Oxford. He told me that his PhD is actually in computational social science, which he did with Rob Axtell.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Is it working? All right. So I'm Omar. Good morning, everyone. And this is joint work with Eduardo López from Oxford as well, my colleague at the Captain Complexity Center, and with Rob Axtell from George Mason University. Back in 2008, I moved to Washington, D.C. to start my PhD at George Mason, and right there was a very heated discussion, which had to do with the fact that the government was pushing for an economic stimulus because the country was going through a financial crisis, right? So two economists got together, and one from the academic circles and another from the policy circles, and they produced a report in which they forecasted what would be the unemployment rate of the economy if this package would be put in place. A couple of years later, this report was severely criticized because their forecast was quite incorrect compared to the real unemployment rate that took place during the crisis. Now, what struck me about this was not really if they got right or wrong the mechanisms behind the crisis, but the fact that this is not the first time this kind of things happen in unemployment forecasts. So that made me think that there had to be something more fundamental about the way we model unemployment, we model labor markets, something about the assumptions that underlie the models that economists used. Some of these assumptions sometimes are taken almost in an axiomatic way. So I went and looked into the literature to see what is the most fundamental model that economists use to understand unemployment. And I can depict it in this cartoon, in which you can think of the labor market as a bucket of employed people and another of unemployed people. You can move some people from employment to unemployment through a separation process, which is basically anything that has to do with why you lose your job. And the other way around, if you want to move from unemployment to employment, it's a bit trickier because it involves a third bucket, which contains firms. Why firms? Because they have the jobs, they create the vacancies that you will be looking for. And the way in which firms and job seekers find each other is through a process called the matching process. Now, here there is a very special assumption that seems to be quite axiomatic, which is if you're a job seeker, you are able to look for any vacancy in the economy. So any job would be available to you, even if that would be with a if some jobs would be with very small probability. It is always possible. And that didn't sound very intuitive to me because that infers some global character to the way we search for jobs. And if you talk to anyone who has gone through this process, or if you have gone through it yourself, you normally look for jobs through specific firms that have to do with your social networks, with your industry, with your skills, etc. So we thought, okay, can we test empirically this hypothesis of the global search, or this assumption? So I came down to Finland to get a Macy data set, which is composed from social security records. So in Finland, they keep track of every worker in the economy and every company, and they match them. So you can check in one day every year in which company each person has been working. And that encompasses the universe of workers and firms for 20 years. We got a similar data set for Mexico. Difference is that this was a sample, but the frequency was daily. So we have a very high resolution of every person and every firm in the sample. So how can we use this data to test the global search hypothesis? Well, we can map this data into a network. We call them labor flow networks. In this network, nodes are companies, and when you have a transition of a person flowing from one firm to another, you draw an edge. If several transitions between the same companies take place, then you have a weighted edge. Well, if we live in a world in which people can search in any vacancy in the economy, then we would expect certain weights for these edges. And of course, if the data shows that an edge has more weight than what we would expect under the global search hypothesis, then we say that that connection is significant. And we can test that for every connection in a data set. And both of our data sets shown that approximately 70% of the connections are significant. That means that 70% of the paths that people take between firms are repeated more often than what we would expect under the standard assumption that we use to model labor markets. Now think on the opposite example. Suppose that there is no global search and there is just local search, and people can only search among those firms that are connected in this labor flow network to their last employer. If we would simulate this process, constrained by this network, of course, we would explain the data. The interesting part here is we can mix these two worlds, the global search and local search, and we can ask the following question. What is the least probability that we need for a person searching locally in order to explain the structure of the data? And the answer is, you would need to mix them with an 80% probability searching locally in order to explain the data, meaning that chances are people tend to search locally, not globally. So we thought this is important, and we have to capture this in the models that we use to understand unemployment. So I'm going to show you the simplest model that we have developed, in which you have a worker which can become separated with through the separation process, but he can also regain employment through a job finding rate, and this rate will be defined by a specific process. So suppose this worker is employed at a company I, and there are a bunch of other companies now that worker can look for employment, can use to look for employment. Well, companies will have what we call technological innovations. That is, if a company innovates in a given period, then hiring new workers will become obsolete. So they will be close to receiving job applications. So you can see that F and G now are unavailable. To the worker, the next step is there is an underlying structure that the workers navigate through to search for jobs. Now, the mechanism here is that only those firms that are directly connected to the last employer are available to the worker. In this case, the firm M becomes unavailable because it's not directly connected. Then the worker will choose one of the two available firms with the same probability and will submit a job application to one of them. In this case, the worker chose firm J. And the success of his job application will depend on the policy that the firm J has. So we can think about this hiring policy as the probability of hiring that applicant. If the applicant is successful, he will regain employment. Otherwise, he will remain unemployed, which defines an interesting quantity because now we have workers that are unemployed and are still associated to that firm. So we define something called firm-specific unemployment, which has never been measured before because we didn't have that kind of data. And one of the main predictions of the model is that the unemployment that is specific to a firm is proportional to the connectivity of that firm. So if you happen to be in a better connected firm, your employment prospects in the future will be better. And we can test this using the Mexican data because their daily frequency allows us to identify unemployment spells and track them through companies. And well, what you have here is about 80,000 firms from that data set. In the horizontal axis, you have the normalized connectivity of the firms, and you can see that it correlates positively with the unemployment that is associated to each one of these firms. And it is very simple to test that this relationship holds. Now, this has very important implications in the way we measure unemployment. First of all, because we need to consider the structure of this network that people navigate when searching in order to think about aggregate unemployment. Because it's not the same to aggregate a very porous structure where you have pools of high density of unemployment than a structure where everything is very uniform. The next implication is that it matters where you have economic shocks, and it matters where you implement the policies. It's not the same if you target firms that are in certain clusters that are not very well connected, and where unemployment most likely will get stuck for longer. Now, we want to use this then to enhance this agent computing, agent-based simulation, and bring some more social science into the model, like introduce some more behavior in our agents. So instead of having these probabilistic processes, now we want to introduce how firms, for example, set their hiring policies. And let me give you an example of how we do this. You can have the simple model that I just presented to you, calibrated, to have the following analytical prediction. You have an unemployment rate through time, and we introduce a shock. This perturbation will shift up the aggregate unemployment. Now we can run the simulation where firms actually have behavior. They adapt to the shock. They learn about the parameters, which are not entirely known. And this shock will be first introduced through the frequency with which firms innovate technologically. So you can see that we can write a model in which that will be consistent with the simple version. It reaches the steady states. But then you can also introduce another shock, which will give you the same analytical prediction, but through a different transmission channel. So instead of the technological shock, you can instead change how expensive it is to hire someone. And firms will react as well. They will reach the steady state, but the trajectory will be completely different. And this is so important for policymakers, because if you are in a crisis, if you're experiencing a shock, and you think that you live in the world of the blue line, but you're actually in the one of the black line, your forecast is going to be off the charts. Finally, I just want to show you our last product, because we want to take this to a broader community, to policymakers, to a general audience. So we have developed a simple tool that puts our model into the hands of anyone interested in understanding labor dynamics. So this is our online application that you can use, and you can provide the model with real data. This is the economy represented as a network of companies, and on the right side, you can see the panel where some aggregate statistics about the economy are being updated in real time. So you can run the model, you have the agents going through the economy, you have the firms setting their hiring policies, you can select firms in which you are especially interested as a policymakers, and think what happens if these firms decrease their hiring rates, and what is the contributions that they will have to the aggregate unemployment, to the unemployment volatility. You can add new firms, you can design entire policy programs and contingency plans in the presence of shocks. And And well, this will go through several versions to improve and incorporate more realistic behavior. And I will be very happy to hear suggestions, comments, and take any questions. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the talk. I have one question.
Where, sorry?
Yeah, here in the back. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, with regard to the recent unemployment crisis and debate in the US, one of the things economists and policymakers seem to struggle with is whether it's structural unemployment or cyclical. Can your tool predict that?
Well, as you saw, this is still a very stylized model. So those are very specific questions that are of interest to specific groups and policymakers. The tool allows us to incorporate any kind of mechanisms, including the business cycle. So we are open, actually, to engage with these communities who have specific questions. So at the moment, we're working on a couple of questions, not exactly the one of business cycle, but things like what happens when you introduce minimum wage policies, which can be considered as shocks. We're interested in looking at the transients moving between steady states and how policies can shape them.
Is there any other question? I had one. So,
Okay.
Do you have a network visualization of all the firms, the 80,000?
Yeah, so that was, well, we have one for 200,000 from Finland, which was published in our paper in 2013, which you can look it in the website. But,
we'll look it up.
We do have that.
Thanks. So thanks everyone for coming to the first session, and let's thank the speaker again.
Thanks.